Good morning, everyone, or good evening if you are in the US and North America. Welcome to the Quantitative History Webinar series. I'm Ziwu Chen, Professor of Finance at the University of Hong Kong. So today we have two speakers, Professor Clair Yang and Professor Huang Yasheng. The arrangement is that Professor Yang will do the presentation, and then Professor Huang will join her in the Q&A session. If you have any questions, both of them will be happy to address them at the end of the presentation. So, following our usual format, we'll start with the presentation for about 1 hour, and then we have Professor Sun from the National University of Singapore to give a brief discussion, and then we'll open the floor to all of you for questions and answers. Just a quick introduction on the speakers today. So Professor Yang, Clair Yang, is currently visiting the Chinese University of Hong Kong. She's an assistant professor at the University of Washington in Seattle. And if you want to know how to best pursue research on quantitative history, Clair's path should be a good example. She got her bachelor's degree in mathematics from Peking University. So that prepared her to do what she's doing now. Of course, in between, she got her PhD in managerial economics from Northwestern University. So after that, she went to the best place to get exposure to quantitative history research at MIT. I imagine that must have been the occasion for her to link up with Professor Huang. As many of you know, Professor Huang is very well known for his research on many topics, especially on India and China. So recently, he has been working on two big quantitative history projects. One is the nature of the Chinese state. The other is the history of technological inventions in China. Okay, so without taking too much more time away from them, let's welcome Professor Yang. Clair, you have not unmuted. Okay, good.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for Professor Chen for the wonderful introduction, and thank you everyone for coming here. This is a joint work with Professor Yasheng Huang from MIT, who's also here today, and we will be happy to take your question once we get to the Q&A section. So the topic today that we want to talk about is what we call the great political divergence. So for those of you in the audience, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with the great divergence literature, where scholars have documented and also discussed potential courses for Western Europe being able to bypass China, India, and other historical superpower and become the leader of the world in terms of trade and economics and technology. So today, what we want to talk about is a political divergence that happened before the economic divergence, and which could have some implication for the latter. So let me just briefly summarize, give an overview of the paper. So in this project, we document an interesting historical phenomenon between the East and the West, which is the timing of institutional change and an improvement in the political stability seems to happen at the same historical time. And then we, in the paper, provide a theoretical framework that help us emphasize insight that very different institutions, in our case, meritocratic bureaucracy or parliament, could serve a functional equivalence of enhancing stability. And the contribution of our paper is, so far, the literature that addresses meritocracy and that addresses parliament, they seem to develop in separate fields. And here we want to combine their insights and provide a more unified theory, as well as a more unified view of political development of historical states. So our paper here is really motivated by two observations. The first one.
Claire, sorry. Yeah. Can you share the screen with us, your PP slides?
Oh, I think I'm sharing it. I'm sorry for that. Give me 1 second.
Not here.
Okay. Okay, can everyone see it?
Okay, good. That's
great. Thank you.
Make it,
1 second. So our paper here is really motivated by two observations. The first one is that many regions, especially Western Europe and China, they achieved significant improvements in political stability over the medieval time. So on the right side here, we have a picture showing the time trend of stability indices for both China and Europe. So on the upper panel here, we have ruler duration, and down here we have deposed probability. Those two indices are widely used by scholars in the field to capture stability in historical states. So ruler duration is how many years a ruler can stay in power, whereas deposed probability is the probability of a ruler being deposed or being forced out as opposed to other natural ways of power exit, such as natural death. So as you can see here, both indices shows a very similar pattern. That is, from the 500 all the way to the 17th century, stability has been constantly increasing for both China and Western Europe. And then another observation is that despite all the talks about revolution and popular uprising, historically, it was coup d'etat and other forms of elite conflicts that were the major threat to political stability. So combining those two, it seems like Western Europe and China has been able to find some kind of institutional solution to elite conflicts. The scholars on Western Europe, European history has long emphasized the importance of parliamentary system. So the usual narratives goes like this. It all starts with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And then the successor states were relatively weak in terms of their fiscal power, so they cannot fund their military expenditure through taxation. And because of that, Charlemagne required the local elites to contribute troops rather than funds. And then because of that, it enhanced the bargaining power of the local elites in many ways, and eventually led to the creation of a landed aristocracy. And the landed aristocracy later served as the major power base for imposing executive constraints on the monarchy. And the parliamentary system, which was developed later, can be seen as a codification and a formalization of the feudalism that is already in place in much of the Europe. So if we look at China from this perspective, it is very interesting that China never developed a parliamentary system, nor any of these executive constraints that were so important for the development of Western Europe. In fact, in China, what we see here is that the political stability co-emerged hand in hand with consolidated absolutism. So this, at least it suggests a possible multiple equilibria in the path to political stability. And in China, during the medieval time, one of the most important institutional development that many historians agreed is the establishment of state bureaucracy and exam-based meritocracy. And the most important institution that was responsible for creating the two is the civil service examination system. The civil service exam system was started during the Sui dynasty. It was later expanded and institutionalized during the Song and was in continual operation for more than 1200 years. It was an important political system. For 13th century, the CSE was the major path to office. For example, during the Ming Dynasty, it produced about 50 to 70% of government officials, depending on the year. And in comparison, purchase only made up 20 to 40%, and inheritance only 1%. So here we're talking about pre-modern states, and such social mobility is really considerable. The CSE is also an education system. So to truly operationalize the y-axis, the government set up free public schools down to the prefecture level first, and then to the county level later. So many scholars has talked about CSE and the profound social and political implication it brought. For example, historians agree that it initiated a social transition, a society that was dominated by landed aristocracy, which is very similar to Western Europe, to one that is dominated by bureaucratic literati. It is also responsible for inducing social mobility and all that. In fact, in one of our forthcoming, among the historians, there seemed to be a debate about how meritocratic the CSE exam actually were. So in one of our paper that is forthcoming in Journal of Politics, we provide evidence based on about 14,000 Ming Dynasty CSE candidates to show that meritocracy is actually a very, very important component of the system and is arguably the most important. In fact, the exam system discriminates against the wealthy candidates. So the CSE, it's important for social transition and social mobility, and all that has been discussed extensively by scholars. In this paper, we want to provide a different perspective on this. We want to focus instead on the impact of the exam on the top of the pyramid. So we want to know how it might have affected elite conflicts and monarchy-aristocracy power balance. Because going back to our earlier evidence, elite conflicts seem to be a major determinant of political stability in historical states. So let me just touch briefly on the literature here. So the CSE type meritocracy, it has long been admired by enlightened intellectuals and scholars, such as Voltaire, Francis Quesnay, and maybe most famously Max Weber. But on the other hand, the general literature on political development seemed to still missing one element, and that is the role and function of bureaucracy. So for example, Fukuyama here and others have argued that the literature on political development is almost entirely based on the experience of Europe. And since bureaucracy did not play a prominent role in state building in Europe, bureaucracy has not received adequate analytical attention. But if we look at political development worldwide, bureaucracy is in fact a very important component. For example, in East Asia, the CSE was introduced to other East Asian countries as early as the 8th century. And this exam system was quickly adopted by Korea and Vietnam and was in place in those countries for almost 1,000 years. However, the exam system did not take roots in Japan, despite the fact that the Japanese court was the first, other than China, to actually implement an exam. So why? Well, as it turned out, in Japan, the exam system was faced with considerable opposition from the aristocratic families. The aristocratic families in Japan actually pushed for feudalism. And eventually, medieval Japan evolved into a society with a power structure very close to other Western European countries, despite the fact that Japan shared much more commonalities with its East Asian neighbors in terms of religion and culture. And historians also found quantitative evidence suggests that a break in the Japanese stability trend actually happened around the time when feudalism emerged in that country. And then if we look at Central Asia, well, the Persian Empire is probably the best example of a bureaucratic state, historical state. So they have administrative tradition, which really flourished during the Achaemenid period, which is 500 to 300 BC. And they have professionally trained bureaucrats with a guild system of their own, and that is open to the common citizen. And those bureaucrats were in charge of important government functions and large public projects. And they formed a strong civil service system based on examination, performance, and pay system, according to historians. And later, in the Muslim period, we see that Muslim polities inherited capable bureaucrats from the Byzantine and Sassanid land, and they also introduced something new, something called Mamlukism, or the use of slave soldiers imported from non-Muslim lands. So Mamlukism is obviously not about bureaucracy, but there is a considerable element of meritocracy incorporated in it. For example, the slaves, the Mamluks, they were purchased at a very young age, and they went through years of rigorous military training. And then, based on their performance, they will be promoted to different positions. They could get positions such as governors of towns or cities, or commanders of army, or even vice sultan. So in many parts of the Middle East, they actually held significant political and military power. So scholars have argued that because of Mamlukism, local elites in the Muslim world did not serve as the source of military recruitment, and thus they were poorly positioned to impose any kind of executive constraints on the rulers. And lastly, we can take a look at Europe. So as we mentioned earlier, bureaucracy had a much less prominent role in European history. Most bureaucratic institutions were set up later than East Asia and Central Asia, and long after democracy was consolidated. But this was not because of a lack of idea. So we have two examples of important monarchies in Europe that try to experiment with bureaucratic institutions. The first one is Prussia. So according to Fukuyama, when Max Weber wrote his famous book on bureaucracy, he was not thinking of the American bureaucracy. He was in fact thinking of the bureaucracy of his native Germany. In Brandenburg, Prussia, the opposite happened, the opposite of the England model. Here in Prussia, the local estates were weak and divided, and a series of resourceful and strong-minded rulers succeeded in progressively stripping the local elites of their political power and concentrating it in the hands of a centralized royal administration. And then the other example is France. So many scholars have written about the bureaucratic institution in France under Louis XIV. But if we look at it from an international standard, the bureaucratic system is actually not as meritocratic as we would imagine. Historians argue that the bureaucratic system in France was still largely sustained by personal connections and patronage instead of formal rules. And the reason they believe is because the royal authority in France was much weaker than we imagined. And the kings and ministers still relied on local elites for the functioning of the states. So let me just briefly summarize. Here we have taken a tour around the world to look at major regions in the world in the medieval time. And three things really stand out in this historical review. Number one, meritocratic bureaucracy indeed played an important role in political development in many parts of the world. And then number two, it seems that even within those regions, it was the strong monarchies that were able to establish meritocratic bureaucracies. Think about East Asia, Korea, China, Vietnam, all adopted the civil service exam system, whereas Japan did not. In contrast, Japan pushed for feudalism, which gives it a social structure that was much closer to the European model. And then within Europe, even within Europe, we have this England model of a weak monarchy and strong local elites, which eventually led to parliamentary system. And we have the Prussian model with a strong monarchy and divided weak local elites. And in that case, they created what Fukuyama considered as the model of modern bureaucracy. And number three, it seems that bureaucracies in turn have implications for political stability and the consolidation of absolutism in the long run. So just to back up the last point, let me show you a few quantitative evidence. So the first piece of evidence is here. So here we constructed a panel of historical rulers in Eurasia from the 5th till 16th century. So the unit of observation here is ruler. The data on ruler information was constructed based on Morby, 1989. The parliamentary system was based on Bladis and Chanley, and then the CISE was based on various national resources in the East Asian countries. So all of those can be, are pretty standard in the field. So what we see here is that both parliamentary system and the civil service exam system were positively and significantly associated with political stability. Here we measure the civil service exam system with two variables. The first one is a dummy, 0 or 1, indicating whether they have a CSE at the time or not. And then the second one is CSE scale, which is the number of 进士 degree holders that were generated by the exam system. In other words, how many candidates successfully passed the exam and entered into the bureaucracy. And as we can see here, both variables are significantly associated with improvements in political stability. And just to dive a little bit deeper into the CSE system, here we provide the time trend of stability in two East Asian countries. One is China, the other is Korea. So the first picture here shows stability in China against the scale of the exam system. The black solid line here represents the scale of CSE, so how many candidates. And the dashed blue line here represents the stability trend. The upper panel shows deposed probability, whereas the lower panel shows ruler duration. So as we can see here, the deposed probability was on the rise until the establishment of the CSE, and then it significantly decreased afterwards. Even the temporary decrease of exam system during the Yuan dynasty was associated with a concurrent increase in instability at that time. And a similar pattern can be seen by looking at ruler duration here. And next, let's take a look at Korea. So the second picture, the second picture here shows the stability trend in Korea against the scale of CSE. And the first panel here shows ruler duration. As you can see, ruler duration was on the decline all the way till the establishment of the CSE, and then it's increasing afterwards. Deposed probability, the same thing. It was on the rise, and then after the establishment and the scale up of the CSE, it dramatically decreased. So in both countries, it seems that the establishment of the CSE is significantly associated with political stability. And it's not just political stability. It is also about what type of political equilibrium they're in. So unfortunately, the best data we can get that allows us to have a cross-country comparison of historical states goes only back to the beginning of the 19th century. So this picture here is based on the Polity IV project. And as you can see here, at the beginning of the 19th century, China had a very similar democracy index as Western Europe. But beneath that similarity, the type of equilibrium is actually very different. In China, what we have is low executive constraint, which is indicated by the blue line here, and very high level of political competition. Whereas in Western Europe, it is high executive constraint and low political competition. Okay. We can even throw in the Muslim world here to have a brief comparison. The Muslim countries are indicated by the green line. And here we can see that they have a very similar democracy index. But down here, we can see that the Muslim equilibrium is actually closer to that of China because it also has low executive constraint and a relatively higher level of political competition. So this is amazing considering that, during the 19th century, Western European countries went through a series of transitions and they were constantly improving their democracy index. But despite all those improvements, they still have a level of political competition that is significantly lower than China. Okay, so all of these really led us to the question. So first, we want to know how did the CSE and other similar meritocratic bureaucracies, how did they contribute to political stability? And number two, we want to understand why it seems that more autocratic countries were more likely to implement these institutions. And then number three, how did these institutions lead to dramatically different type of political equilibrium? In Western Europe, we have high executive constraints and low political competition, which eventually led to constitutional monarchy. Whereas in China, we have low executive constraints and high competition, which led to meritocratic absolutism in the long run. Okay, so before I give you the model, let me just briefly talk about existing models in the literature that addresses bureaucracy. So generally speaking, there are at least two perspectives in the literature. The first one is the ideal type concept of bureaucracy, which goes back to Max Weber. So they look at bureaucracy as the most efficient type of organization that is characterized by hierarchy and unit of command and division of labor, task specializations, and all that. And there is a second strand of literature which looks at bureaucratic organizations as self-interest agents. So they argue that particularly in developing countries, bureaucrats could hijack and exploit the system and lead to bureaucratization. So our idea here is different from both approach. The main reason that we are different is because we focus on a different time period. So here we're really looking at the role of bureaucracy in the development of historical states. If we look at modern states, then Tabellini and Alesina has a famous paper that considers bureaucrats as an alternative to politicians. So that is for modern states. But if you look at historical states, what are the, what can be considered as an alternative? Well, in this paper, we argue that an alternative to bureaucrats in historical states is aristocrats, nobility. Because bureaucrats, various historians have described bureaucracy as merit-based, as professionalized. In other words, the position of a bureaucrat depends on his ability. Whereas for aristocrats, the position depends on their birth, depends on their inheritance. So why is this difference between bureaucrats versus aristocrats important? Well, because in historical states, there could be two things. On one hand, we have de jure political institutions, like the king and the duke. So all those de jure institutions governs the official allocation of political ranks. And on the other hand, we have de facto political power, which could be determined by a wide variety of factors, including personal capabilities, ambitions, knowledge, and all military talents and all that. And the de facto political power, even though it may not be reflected in the institutions, it might still determine the outcome of conflicts. And what makes it even more interesting is that those two things may not always be the same. There could be a mismatch between the two. So imagine that the son of a duke is always a duke, the son of a king is going to be the next king. But the heir to the throne may not have the qualities that lives up to his responsibility. Whereas a military genius could be born in a commoner family. So in either case, we have a mismatch of de jure institution and de facto power. And we can easily imagine that de jure institutions, they tend to be stable and history dependent, whereas de facto power, it can change all the time with birth and death and illness and new technology. So there could be stochastic shocks to de facto power. So we can imagine the king be high type or low type, the aristocrats be high type or low type, which might be their private information, and it may not be reflected in the de jure institutions in a timely manner. And this mismatch could create a source of instability for historical states. And then institutional improvements, such as the parliamentary system or CSE, they can be understood as a mechanism to reduce the information asymmetry here. But they differ in the direction of information flow. For example, parliamentary meetings, it provides a venue for the nobility to learn about the king, whereas standardized exams provide information about the aristocrat's ability. So both institutions reduce the mismatch, but they differ in the direction of information flow. And here we have our benchmark model. So here let's consider a single period two-player game with the king and the aristocrat playing against each other. So both of them has an initial wealth, WK and WA. And then the king makes a proposal to readjust their wealth. This proposal is made before any kind of shocks is realized. So this is a proxy for de jure institution. And then after the king makes the proposal, nature sends shocks to the de facto power of the king and the aristocrat. In this case, the shock can be high or low with equal probability, and that remains their private information. And then afterwards, the aristocrats determined whether he want to initiate a coup or accepts the proposal. If he initiates a coup, then the aristocrat wins with a probability that is proportional to his de facto power. And then in the end, whoever wins enjoys all the wealth minus a portion that gets disrupted in the coup. So this is a very simple single period standard proposal game. Here we assume away any other kind of asymmetric information. For example, there's no moral hazard problem here. The only uncertainty is created by the mismatch of de jure institution and de facto power. Okay, so in this benchmark model, if there's no uncertainty, no instability. We get coups and we get political instability out of this game precisely because of the random shocks to king and the aristocrats' de facto power. And in the equilibrium, let me just walk you through very briefly the equilibrium. When the destructiveness of the coup is large, we can imagine that the seriousness of the coup would deter any kind of coup inclination. So in this case, the game has a unique stable equilibrium. On the other hand, when the military conflicts are not so destructive, the game could have two types of equilibrium. So when the potential mismatch is low, we have stable equilibrium. But when the potential mismatch is high, we can have unstable equilibrium where the king makes a proposal and the aristocrats coup in half of the time. So all of these are pretty straightforward. Okay. What makes it more interesting is if we consider institutional improvements. So now assume that we have institutions that can send a signal before the aristocrats makes his move. So in this case, depending on the type of institution, the parliamentary institution would send a signal of the king. In other words, it will publicly send a signal that let us know a bit more about the king's hidden ability. And a CSE, a civil service exam system, would send a signal of the aristocrats. It will tell us a bit more about the aristocrats' hidden ability. And how would this public signal affect the outcomes? Well, under a parliamentary system, this is pretty straightforward. The signal comes out before the aristocrats is making a move. So the aristocrats will update his belief about the ability of the king using Bayesian rule, and then he will plan his coup decision accordingly. Under a CSE institution, it's a little bit tricky because the information comes out after the king is already made his move. In other words, the signal could not change the king's behavior. But it will allow the king to make his initial proposal conditional on the signal. So this is what we believe characterize a bureaucratic institution. In other words, your position does not depend on your birth, but it depends on a signal that informs us about your ability. Okay. And then under the CSE institution, because this is really the focus of the paper, we have the following equilibrium results. So there is really no need to read through all those Greek letters. Let me just give you a brief idea. There are several interesting comparative statics that stands out of this equilibrium results. First, just like the benchmark game, we know that when the mismatch, the potential mismatch gets higher, we have more instability. That's pretty straightforward. And then what is more interesting is that the civil service exam system not always improve stability. You can imagine this because the CSE essentially enabled the king to better discriminate against the low-type aristocrats. So he can make a smaller offer of wealth to the low-type aristocrats, which inevitably induced a small fraction of high-type aristocrats to coup because they were unlucky to have a low signal. So depending on the parameter, a CSE institution could improve or decrease political stability. And what is interesting here is that when the signal gets more informative, there will be more stability improvement. So this accords very well with the comparison of the Muslim world and China, because in China, the CSE system is a very rigorous system with strict formal rules. So we can think of it as a signal that is relatively informative. It's relatively precise about the underlying ability. Whereas in the Muslim world, even though the Mamlukism has an element of meritocracy incorporated in it, it still relies heavily on loyalty and connections and patronage. So it is a less informative signal. And in our model setting, it could lead to a decrease in political stability. And then in figure 5 here, if the king alone can decide an institutional improvement towards the CSE, then we would see all the red regions being where the CSE institution would be established, and the shaded region indicates where stability would be improved. So as you can see here, there's a small region of the red lines on this picture that indicates an establishment of CSE, but a decrease in political stability. And then under the parliamentary system, we have a very similar equilibrium structure, but with a little bit more complex parametric setting. Here, political stability also depends on two things. First, the destructiveness of the coup, and secondly, the informativeness of the signal. And what is interesting here is that the utility of the king is always, even though sometimes weakly, higher under the CSE system compared to either the parliamentary system or the system with no institutional improvements. And a very similar result is that the level of absolutism, which we measured by the king's wealth as a share of total wealth, is always highest under the CSE and lowest under the parliamentary system. And lastly, if we assume that the players with more wealth can then decide on an institutional improvement, then what we get will be a scenario which is indicated in picture 7 here. So in picture 7, in the upper half of the graph, we have the king being the player with more wealth. And the institutional improvement he will initiate institutional improvement towards a CSE. Whereas in the lower half of the picture here, the aristocrats is the relatively more powerful one, and they will push for an institutional improvement towards parliamentary system. And in both cases, we have a significant portion of the space witness an increase in political stability. Okay. Let me check on the time. Okay, I think I'm right on time here. So far, as I said in the beginning, this is a very preliminary paper. We have not been able to do everything that we wanted so far. For example, in the current version, we did not address power dynamics. But you can easily imagine that with the king prefers CSE and the aristocrats prefers parliament, there could be a positive feedback loop between absolutism and meritocratic institutions. And another thing is that if if there is a huge temporary shock happening to the de facto power of either agent in the early stage, that temporary shock could have a long-lasting impact on institutional development in the long run. And another thing that we want to explore is, so far we only have 2 players, but how would institution affect the coordination among the aristocrats? So here, let me briefly sums up. In this paper, the number one thing that we want to bring attention to is the importance of meritocratic bureaucracy in the political development of historical states, especially their potential impact on monarchy-aristocracy power balance. And this really brings us back to a seminal idea, which was first proposed by Huntington and later summarized and expanded by Fukuyama. So what this idea is about is that order itself was an important goal of developing societies, independent of the question of whether that order was democratic or authoritarian or socialist or free market. And the great political divergence that we show here between Europe and China illustrates exactly this Huntington conjecture. And our paper, is based on this idea, and we formalized the insight. One takeaway from the paper is that both meritocratic and parliamentary system could be equilibrium institutions because they solve a common problem. And those institutions could have long-run implications for political stability. And as a side note, one of a spin-off project of this one is that we want to look at how business relationship develop under those 2 different political structure. So Professor Huang and I were working on another project that looks at the political origins of asset ownerships. So thank you very much. With that, I will give it back to Professor Chen.
Thank you, Claire. Okay, thank you so much, Claire. You just give us a very excellent and a fantastic talk about the comparative political development between China and the West. We always talk about for economic historians, we always talk about the economic divergence, the great divergence, right, between China and Europe. And now we see that there's also a very amazing political divergence. So now let's turn to our discussion session. Today we are very honored to have Professor Tuanhei Sun Chuanwei 教授 from National University of Singapore. Professor Sun is a young economic historian. He also worked on China, especially the comparative history between China and Europe, as well as the comparative history between China and Japan. So Professor Sun will discuss Clair's presentation for maybe 10 or more minutes, or maybe 15 minutes. Okay, so please.
Let me share my screen. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So it's my honor to discuss this paper. I enjoy reading it very much. So it is an early draft, but you can see the potential of the paper by the interest of the research question and how, in some sense, this paper is able to elegantly put two mechanisms that are related, but somehow it's hard to put them together. Civil service examination and political representation in the form of parliament together in the same framework and analyze them in a way that I feel shed important lights on the not just the political divergence between China and Europe, but also on the relative strengths and weaknesses of the two mechanisms. So let me just start by talking about the motivation. So the research question, around the 8th to 10th century, China embraced civil service examination while Europe developed parliamentary representation. The question is why? Why does this happen? It is important because it's something that we ought to care. Why do we care? We care because of the great economic divergence. We know that at least by the 18th century, we see a great economic divergence between China and Europe. There is a large literature emphasizing the link between executive constraints and long-term economic development. And in this literature, China, the explanation is that China does not grow as fast as maybe it could have because of absolutism. Whereas in the case of Europe, it benefited from parliamentary democracy and the presence of checks on the executive. So we care about the political divergence, not just for its own sake. I think by itself, it is a very important and interesting question to think about. But we care about the question also because we care about the great economic divergence, and we're still living in it by and large. Another reason why I think we should care about the question is because if you, as Fukuyama points out, China was the first civilization to create a modern state. So this is, I think, by itself an interesting historical question. Why did this happen? And if you think about China, we tend to think about Chinese institutions as relatively autocratic. How is it that bureaucracy, which we tend to think about it as something like a modern creation, how is it that bureaucracy is compatible with something as not exactly archaic, but relatively less modern, a relatively less modern concept like autocratic institutions? So the compatibility of bureaucracy and autocracy is an important phenomenon that I think it's important to understand. So the main argument of the paper, historical states like modern states face instability, but in many ways, probably more so. So a major source of instability comes from this mismatch between de jure political institutions and de facto political power. So power can change, and when that change, that could lead to mismatch. So you can have stochastic shocks to de facto power, so that de facto power does not, or de jure institutions do not reflect de facto political power accurately. And when that happens, that can generate information asymmetry, which lead to coups. So as Claire mentioned in her presentation, information asymmetry, it's key. Because if there is no asymmetry, then the king can always design an offer to present it to the aristocrats, an offer that the aristocrats will accept. So it's asymmetry that leads to this, that is the source of instability. So Professor Huang and Professor Yang argued that if you think about civil service examination and parliamentary representation, as different as they look, they are actually substitutes. They are mechanisms that can actually help to decrease the information asymmetry between the king and the elites, or the king and the aristocrats. So by decreasing information asymmetry, these institutions promote political stability. The two mechanisms, or the two sets of institutions, work in different directions though, according to them. According to them, civil service examinations provide info to the king about the elites or aristocrats' ability, whereas parliamentary meetings provide information about the king to the elites. So they work in different directions with different distributional outcomes. So they also provide empirical evidence based on 112 historical countries, showing that civil service examinations and parliamentary meetings are associated with longer reigns and lower disposed probability. So let me go to my comments. So I think it's obvious to everyone, this is a big and important question, especially for those who knows the work of Professor Huang. I know many of you know that Professor Huang doesn't do small questions. This is very big, a very big question, very important one. I think I think it opens up it has the potential to open up a series of papers later. So what I enjoy particularly about this paper, besides the thing that it addresses an important question, is that it provides a elegant framework that allows for some like a novel comparative analysis of two competing mechanisms. Because really, if you think about civil service examinations and parliamentary representation meetings, how do you bring them together in one framework and analyze them, compare them, and think about their distributional outcomes? I think this is very hard to do. It's very nicely done in the paper. I think this is something that is hard to achieve. Okay, so it's also on this point that I would like to push the authors slightly. So I would like to raise this issue. Does the model sufficiently capture the most salient characteristics of civil service examination and parliamentary representation? So let me elaborate. So if you think about civil service examination, for example, a salient characteristic or function of the civil service examination is actually elite selection. Who gets to enter the bureaucracy? In the paper, the function of the civil service examination is to review information about the elites. I think there is room for these two to be reconciled, but as in the way that the paper is written now, it is not clear to me how to reconcile these two. Perhaps it is not your, like you do not agree that the key function of civil service examination is elite selection, but if it is, right, I think the two has to be tied. Like how this thing, it's equivalent or sufficiently equivalent to revealing information about the elites. I think it's something that needs to be worked upon, because as it is now, it is not clear to me what information civil service examination reveal about the elites. Because if you think about a civil service examination that takes place once every 3 years, in some sense, right, when you are talking about a big country with a lot of examiners, the quality of the of people who pass the examination is going to be more or less relatively stable because of the law of large numbers and so on and so forth. So it's not so clear to me how to think about the civil service examination in the model and relate this thing back to how, like, at least people would generally perceive civil, like the role of civil service examination. So I think this is something that perhaps can be like work on a bit a little bit more. In some sense, you can say the same about parliamentary meetings, but I think I can actually like understand. I can see how parliamentary meetings reveal information about the king, because like I am like from a region, I go to the parliament, and then in the capital city, I can see some things that happens. I know, I learn things about the king. So this part I do buy, and I can see like a clearer link between the model and the history. But I also think that one key role of the parliament is actually to bargain for elites and the king, and elites among themselves, to trash out their differences, voice out their opinions, and in some sense get to some kind of agreement, hopefully. And I think, like, I don't think this is like you must bring this thing into the model, but I think like some elaboration on that and discussion on why, like, if you think about this role of parliamentary meetings, why it does not, it's not going to affect the outcomes of the model. I think some discussion would actually be helpful. Another thing would be this, the prediction in a model that civil service examination can actually decrease stability in some circumstances. I think Claire discussed this in some details in her presentation. So I find the results intriguing, and like this point that you raised in your presentation about like civil service examination being able to pick up like relatively accurate information, and that helps to ensure that this stability decreasing mechanism, like effect, does not take place. I think this is very helpful. It would actually be nice if we can think about certain time or place where you have civil service examination, but somehow the implementation of this can actually decrease political stability in a way that some like that the ruler still benefits. I think this would actually add a lot of punch to your argument. So one last thing would be why 8th to 10th century? Because the question is set out that, okay, during the 8th to 10th century, we see this political divergence. I don't think that like this needs to be delivered in the model, but a bit more discussion on the timing. Why is it like, is it just a pure coincidence? Is there something deeper behind it? I think a little bit more discussion on that would actually be helpful. So with that, I end my discussion. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, Chen Wei. Thank you so much for the very wonderful comments. Well, so now Professor Yasheng Huang is also here. So Professor Huang and Claire, you can respond now to Professor Sun's comments.
Yeah, so let me just first of all, thank Zhiwu for inviting us, and thanks Tonghui for an excellent commentary on our paper. It is it is a preliminary paper, and we usually say when we go make a presentation on the first page, the most important words are very preliminary. Everything else is less important. So I think, yeah. So it is a question that. So I think we're trying to model both the functions and the mechanisms, and maybe there's some tightening up that we need to do, right? So I think the functions we feel relatively good about, right? So as you pointed out, these two very different institutions, and we bundle them together as serving a similar function. So we feel that to the extent there is some novel aspect to our paper, that could be one of them. But the mechanism, yeah, so I think it requires more thinking. You know, the information is one mechanism, and the other is, to some extent, I think it's closer to your view of CSE, right, which is representation of your capability, right? So if I have a system that systematically puts most able people at a disadvantage, at some point, the system is going to collapse, right? So, and it could be through the information mechanism. I know more about you now. I know your capabilities now. I reward you according to the level of the capabilities you demonstrate, and then you'll be happy, right? So that could be one. And the other is maybe the other mechanism is really the incentive, right? So you have high capability, but you're not really being rewarded for it. And then I design a system that incentivizes you to use your capability to my advantage, right, as a king, right? So the parliament and the CSE can do that. So it's a very, very good comment, and Claire and I would talk about these different mechanisms. There could be more other mechanisms that get to the same place, right?
I wonder if I can add on to Professor Huang's point. So first of all, Tuan-Wei, thank you for your excellent, insightful comments. I can't agree more, in fact, especially on the first point that you raised. So you mentioned that you want us to think more about what is the true function of a civil service exam versus a parliament. And on top of the revealing ability mechanism that we discussed in the paper, you also mentioned that a civil service exam is important because it provides an elite selection mechanism. And then some other literature also talked about the function of the parliament being not just a venue for revealing information about the king, but also a venue for the aristocrats to coordinate on collective actions. So actually both points we think are very important, and we will be able to incorporate both points with an extension of the model that we're currently experimenting with. So in this, the second version of the model, we're thinking about, not just have one aristocrats, but have multiple aristocrats. And then they will have a coordination issue going on within them. And then the civil service exam, by providing conditional offer to them, will attract the high abilities and leave out the low abilities. And the parliamentary system will have a similar outcome in terms of breaking up the coordination, but in a slightly different way. You can imagine the signal of the king being a public signal that all the aristocrats can coordinate it upon, and they can all act after receiving a good signal. So I think that is excellent, and that is exactly what we are trying to achieve in the next version. A little bit more about your third question. You asked why this happened during the 8th and 10th century. We have some thoughts on the China's case, because historians, especially new developments in quantitative history, has found that the aristocrat families were destructed during the end of the Tang Dynasty. So potentially because of the continuous civil war or because of some peasants' revolution. So either case, we see the aristocratic families being considerably weakened during that period. And that actually served as an exogenous shock to decrease the aristocrats' de facto power. And that might enable the king to seize the opportunity and institutionalize a civil service exam system that benefits himself in the long run. So we have these thoughts on China. We did not elaborate on it too much in the paper because we don't have similar insights about other regions of the world. So we don't want to be too ambitious in terms of that. But that's an excellent question, and we will certainly try to get more on that.
So Claire, it's a little bit tricky, right? So and because the model would predict that you want to improve institutions when the aristocracy is strong, right? When the mismatch in favor of the aristocracy is bigger. And then I think it depends on how we think about how the CSE came about, right? Was it because of 顶层设计, you know, top down or bottom up? So I think we kind of need to.
I think it's actually consistent with your model, because when the aristocratic families are weakened in your model, right, it's more likely that the CSE is going to be adopted when the king is powerful. So it seems to me that it is very consistent with your argument.
Okay. Yeah.
So I just want to say thank you, and just to reiterate, this is a big paper. I'm sure when the paper is formally out, many people will enjoy reading it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So anything to add, Claire? No?
Yeah, I am good.
Okay, then now let's turn to the Q&A from the audience. Okay.
Can I add just
yes, of course, please.
two quick comments. One is on the ruler duration and political stability. Actually, in one of your first charts, I know you guys would like to interpret that after the introduction of the civil service examination, then political stability has been improving, and also was very similar to what Europe had. But if you actually look at the ruler duration line for Europe, it was moving very smoothly and steadily upward. Whereas for China, then it was swinging big time, right? So I thought that chart should show that in the China case, the political stability was remaining a big challenge, because otherwise you would not have the already smoothened line for ruler duration just going up and down so much in China, as opposed to the very smooth, steady upward movement experienced by Europe. So I would not say that Europe and China had similar political stability. If anything, China was still, well, even to this day, today, China is still struggling, trying to have a finally, very stable political system, so that power transition is never really a challenge. That's one. I understand you guys are biased to want to try to make China no different than Europe, and then you want to go on to develop the model to explain, to justify that. My second comment is about the mechanisms again. I mean, maybe if I would want to play devil's advocate, yeah, you probably can say that, starting from the Tang Dynasty, and then the Song Dynasty and Ming and Qing, every dynasty lasted for more than, at least more than 200 years. If you use the duration of each dynasty as a metric, then the Han Dynasty actually lasted much longer, more than 400 years. And then the Song Dynasty, a little over 300 years, and Ming and Qing, more than 200 years. So using that metric, I would say, well, maybe the Tang and Song, what they mostly did was to restore the bureaucratic or administrative system introduced by the Han Dynasty. Of course, in between, there were so many wars and so many different divisions and so on, that made it tough to really rule the whole China as one single country. But what I'm also trying to say is that so many other things happened during the Tang, and especially the Song Dynasty, when it comes to the spreading to the grassroots level of Confucianism, and then the efforts or the focus on building the Confucian clan that really was started during the Song Dynasty. So it's not just the introduction of the civil service examination system in the early Song Dynasty, but also the focus on building the much larger Confucian clan and promoting it to the grassroots level, so that social stability was much better achieved at the bottom of the society, and that allowed the upper class, the aristocrats and the ruling family to have a much easier time to govern the whole country, so that stability was achieved that way. I'm just trying to propose another sort of mechanism or interpretation of what actually happened starting from the 10th century, especially starting from the 11th century onwards. Okay, these are my two quick comments.
Can I just quickly respond to Professor Chen's first point? First of all, thank you so much. Those are wonderful points. Just quickly response to the first one. You mentioned that in the graph, we show that the stability trend for Europe was very smooth and upward, whereas for China is a lot of up and down. That is true. And that is because China, we have only one observation point. Whereas in Europe, we have, several, sometimes hundreds of countries. And then when we do an average of those, they tend to be more smooth over time, whereas China has a lot more volatility. That's
only a small part of it. Actually, we have a paper on a similar topic, just on that point. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's about the graph. But you're absolutely right that, in China, there's a lot of things happen at the same time, and there's really no way for us to have a convincing identification and say, okay, civil service exam caused the improve in political stability. So that's why in the paper, we were actually very careful in saying that it is associated with, but we don't know for sure whether it's the cause or not. Yeah. Professor Huang, do you want to elaborate on the second point?
Yeah, so on the stability, Wang at Harvard has a paper that does show that the average tenure of Chinese emperors was longer after the 10th century, became longer as compared with European kings and rulers. I think the other measure that Clair shows is that the Poe's probability, and that came down rather dramatically after the CSE was instituted, because that's a measure that in the modern era, most of the collapse of the authoritarian regimes is not because of mass rebellions, right? So the Arabic Spring is actually an anomaly. It's really usually elite rebellions, and that did come down substantially, so I think Zhu, you made a very interesting point about the regime stability vis-a-vis the stability of the ruler. So Clair and I would think about that, right? So Han Dynasty was definitely 400 years, and the later dynasties did not last that long, but the individual ruler managed to rule for longer periods of time. Why is that? That's actually an interesting question to look at.
Okay, thank you, Professor Huang. Thank you, Clair, and Professor Chen's comments. Well, now let's pick up some questions from the audience. I believe we have actually received many good and interesting questions and comments from the audience, from both economists and historians. So the first question is from Professor Sasha Becker. Brilliant talk and thought-provoking ideas. It's bureaucracy, and you use it by definition central bureaucracy. Arguably, some medieval cities in Europe had bureaucracies and even city-level councils that were elected, the so-called medieval constitutionalism, but their reach was local. What you mentioned during the talk for Prussia likely describes the central bureaucracies that developed alongside Prussia's expansion. Is that right?
Well, if I may, this is an excellent question. Thank you, Sasha, for raising this interesting question. So just to clarify, in the paper, we use bureaucracy to mean any type of political allocation that is to some degree based on performance and merit. In other words, your political position is not determined by your birth, but rather your personal ability. We do realize that those kind of meritocratic bureaucracy tends to be more likely to arise in central administrations rather than local. So somehow it gets intertwined with the question about federalism versus centralization. In this paper, we try to stay away from that because that would be a totally different question by itself. So Professor Huang, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to just want to make a related point. I think in terms of mechanism, it's really the recruitment that is the central part of our story. It's not so much that you have a group of people who carries a title, they are bureaucrats, right? It's really how they are being recruited. And this is why the Enlightenment thinkers thought very highly of the Chinese bureaucracy, not just because there's a bureaucracy, it's really how systematic the method of the recruitment was. And this is what Max Weber said about the bureaucracy, depersonalized the recruitment. And this is why the Chinese political system had a very high level of competition. So if you look at the definition of competition in the polity dataset, which is the dataset we used, it is about recruitment, elite recruitment. And China had a very competitive, systematic recruitment method, whereas Europe definitely didn't have nearly the kind of competitive recruitment mechanism as China did. England began to adopt that very later on, and England, the system in England was domain specific, right? Whereas China, it's much broader.
Okay, the second question is from a historian, Dr. Ann Kuzdale from Chicago State University. Thank you for this talk. I'm a historian of medieval Europe. In the West, the first and the most influential bureaucracy is found in the Church, the Eastern Christendom of Byzantium, and the Roman Latin Christendom of the West. This is much earlier than the examples used here of France of Prussia or Prussia in the 17th or 18th century. Western Christendom, Roman Latin Church becomes the model for medieval European kingships. Note Charlemagne in the 9th century, the diplomatic coups of the Vatican, especially in the era of the Renaissance, it's the model for early modern European states. Does your work take into consideration the role of the papacy in this period? It seems that the comparison between the 1,000-year Chinese world and the 1,000-year papal world of medieval Europe would be interesting to examine. Yeah.
Claire, you can answer that one. It's too difficult for me.
Well, this is a very difficult question, I have to admit. Well, thank you, Anne, for this wonderful question. I don't think in this current version of the paper that we have given much thought to the papacy, mostly because we want to stay away from any religion issue. Because when you dive into religion, there is the balance and account and all of that. So in the current version, we only focus on the monarchy versus aristocracy power balance. But you are absolutely right. We did not consider the bureaucracy in the Christian church, and maybe that's something we should include in the next version.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, perhaps the last question we will give a chance to our PhD student. Thanks for the lecture. About the descriptive evidence part, it seems to me that the China part, both emperor ruling lens and the deposed possibility, are confounded with too many historical events and trends that are probably more influential than CSE. Would that kind of undermine your agreement here?
I think that's pretty much the same question that Professor Chen raised earlier about confounding factors during the same period. So I guess a short answer to that is yes, we agree that we cannot agree more. There could be other confounding factors happening at the same time. But there are two things. One is, it is impossible to get an identification in the sense. So we treat the correlation results as the best as we can get. And another one is that because the goal of the paper is to make cross-country comparison, so we rely more on the indices that has been widely used by other scholars for other regions. For example, we'll look at ruler duration and deposed probability other than other indices that are more China-specific.
Okay. Actually, we still have so many interesting questions from the audience, but for a time limit, we have to stop here. And we will forward all of your questions and comments to Professor Huang and Claire later for their consideration. Yeah, so today we will stop here. Thank you so much, Professor Huang, Claire, for your wonderful talk. And thank you so much, Professor Tuanwei Sun and Professor Chen's comments. So now let me release the next week's event. Yeah, next Thursday, November 19, we will have a talk on financial history. We will be very happy to have Professor Fabio Briggen from the Tilburg School of Economics and Management. He will talk about the inflation and investors' behavior from historical events in the context of Germany. So thank you for your listening today, and hope to see you again next week. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.